So what we're going to be covering is what I would call the hard ground. This is the stuff which typically you hear about in the context of other people's problems, and one of the big fears we have is that it's going to go from being other people's problems to being our problem. I want to set a piece of context here, which is 1/3 of the people who die every year, all human beings, die of poverty. So every year, 20 million people die of lack of food, lack of water, lack of access to medical care, smoky cooking fires, and this kind of stuff. And that is a real issue, right? I mean, that is a proper, big-scale problem, which has been ongoing at one level of severity or another for your entire life. Can I ask you, has it affected any of you personally? Have you, one? Right, sure, right. I mean, is anybody here devoting 20% of their time or their money to fixing poverty in the developing world? Okay, one, right? Two.
I educated my son across 49 years.
Okay, very good, right? Believe me, I do believe that counts, because intergenerational change is how we really fix some of this stuff, right? But the point that I'm making is, large-scale suffering, misery, and death have been with you your entire lives in places that were not sufficiently close to you for you to take action on. The idea that your lives might be about to get abruptly harder simply means welcome to the real world, where all of us live. A social collapse means living in the same condition as the people who grow your coffee. So the first thing is, it's time to sober up and get real about the peak oil narrative, where we go from 80% of humans being too poor to buy energy to 95% of humans being too poor to buy energy. It's not the end of the world. It's rejoining the rest of the human race. And much as we may think that we have severe poverty in the West, it's a joke. You don't know anybody who's died being poor in all probability, but that is the common fate of 1/3 of humanity. So the framework that we are in is unusual for this debate in as much as it is a global framework that does not privilege the Western experience. There's a region of India called Kerala where people live on $1 a day. Their average income is $1 a day. It's about a 70th of the US and probably about a 40th of Ireland's average income. Right? How long do you reckon those people live? 50s? 60s? 78. Average life expectancy is 78 or 76. Literacy, you might think 30%, no, 95%, right? On $1 a day. So what you think of as poverty is not just an absence of money, it's also crappy social organization, which leaves you in misery where you could have plenty. Because everybody in the world making $1 a day, if their societies worked properly, could live almost as long as Europeans do if they followed the Kerala model. So I wanted to frame the kind of terrain that we're in because it's a very different perspective on these issues from the one which is more common. And although a lot of what I'm going to say is superficially similar to the general collapse narrative, I want to make sure that you understand that it's embedded in a global perception. Okay, so we will begin. If this will behave. Uh-oh. Sorry. So, first thing, every few slides there'll be one of these. When you see one of those, if you have a question, just shout out, right? We'll take a couple of short questions just for clarification on that section and then move on to the next bit. Please don't leave all of your questions for an enormous pile at the end, okay? All right, so the function of government that we rely on most is government's ability to manage risk. It does the kind of stuff about national security, about disease, about sanitation, that reduces your risk of dying in daft ways to practically nil, except when you have things like large-scale wars. The problem that we're facing is that government's ability to manage risk has started to fail in critical areas. On environment, we had both Kyoto and Copenhagen, where all of the world's governments, led by the big democracies, got together and completely failed to figure out how not to burn the world to pieces. This is a failure in governance. We needed them to get together, make an agreement, enforce the agreement, and sort the problem in the same way that they did for the ozone hole, right? CFCs, remember the ozone hole? They actually got on top of that one and they fixed it. On environment, in terms of land use and specifically in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, they've totally failed to get on top of it, and the consequences could be diabolical. The economy is a similarly risky proposition. You've got banks all over the world endangering the lifestyles of entire continents, and the governments are failing to regulate in a way that gets on top of the problem. And the final category is this thing, extraordinary risks, which is stuff like pandemic flu or asteroid strikes, where relatively small amounts of money are required for specialised teams to go and at least map the problem, and the governments are just not funding a lot of it. The asteroid guys, last time I checked, needed 30 million to conduct a scan that would give us 30 years warning of an incoming asteroid strike, and they couldn't raise the money. And this is the basic reason why. So every 4 years, you get to vote, and you're going to vote for less or more. And then another few years pass, and you get to vote for less or more, and people consistently, on average, which is all that matters in a democracy, vote for more and more and more and more. And by the time you get to the cliff edge, you don't have the choice of voting for less anymore because you're already committed to the high burn path. See? Every time we vote for a government, we're picking who has control of the national credit card, and they offer us toys, and we say yes. Right? What would you like for your birthday? More or less? Oh, we'd like more. You realise that you're going to have to pay that off later, don't you? Yeah, absolutely. Just give me the Scalextrics. And this is what we do at a national scale every 4 years, right? The short-term biases and the populist biases embedded in democracy make it extraordinarily hard for us to say no to short-term gain. Human nature combined with our short terms of service produce this kind of effect. There is an alternative, and I don't think we want to go down this path, do we? Right? Eco-Stalinism, eco-Maoism, do we think that that's an acceptable approach? Let's try and find something else. So, if government is the wrong place to manage big risks, we're going to have to examine where you might do it that is not government. Reasonable? That's the premise we're going to proceed from. Because we have to go beyond the current system, which doesn't work, and right now electoral democracy is not changing the risk management behaviour of states nearly as fast as the risks are moving. Right? If you think about the kind of massive financial collapse scenarios, if you even think about, how did you wind up with 1 million extra bedrooms in Ireland? Those houses were built a brick at a time, right? Nobody said, whoa, hang on, this is insane. Right? Maybe they did, but certainly nobody listened to them. So, given that it is not functioning at either the nation-state level or the global level, we have to go beyond the current model. Yeah, you looked like you had a question.
Oh, well, I just wanted to ask you previously, actually.
Yes.
Kerala communist state.
Ah, yes. Democratically elected matriarchal market communism. If anybody can even translate what that means in conventional terms, please. Well, yeah, but it's a funny, it's a very peculiar political system. They're democratically elected, so we're still inside of a democratic rather than an authoritarian paradigm. But they're communist, but they're not centralized communist, they're actually market communist, and what surprises me is there just aren't very many good books that describe how Kerala does what it does. And most of the developing world countries you would think would have an embassy there trying to copy the model, and almost nobody does. So Kerala, just if you need like a serious injection of hope for the future of the human race, they're at 0.6 environmental footprint. They live on $1 a day. They've got massively effective healthcare, education, and long lifespan. It's potentially a global solution where you can do the sums on a spreadsheet and think the whole human race could live this way and life would be all right. So we are not hopeless. It just means a lot of bicycles. So I'm going to press on. So this is the core premise. If the government isn't going to do it, it's going to come back to us. And the question is, what could we build instead of the state to do this job? Right? Or not even necessarily as a replacement, but alongside of. Because the state is something that was theoretically constituted from our individual wills. So the idea that we might constitute other bodies to take care of this stuff is not unreasonable in any way, shape, or form. This is a model. This is a way that people try and manage a wide range of risks without relying on the state or just about anything else. Green Wizards, the Archdruids thing, John Michael Greer. So individuals who learn how to build a whole range of basic utilities, who then put those utilities and the knowledge to build them at the disposal of their neighbours in a crisis. Transition towns, how many of you are heavy transition folks? Right? Oh, less than I would have expected. Interesting. Right? Transitions basically communalizes the management of supply chains for things like food and essential services in a way that could potentially be very effective at quite a large scale in a crunch. Dark Mountain is Dougal and Paul King's North show, and a lot of what they're doing is finding the space to be able to turn the ship. To be able to say, look, we know this works here because we used to do it this way 300 years ago and it took them 50 years to stop us. That's very interesting. And it's this thing of awakening possibilities that are currently off the edge of the map, but we know they work for people a lot like us, just a lot further in the past, or sometimes the future. So the first question is, how do we compare these things? Because if we're going to build new risk management capability, we need some framework for evaluating systems for handling risk. Right? We've got to be able to compare one thing to another to know where to put our resources. Yes?
An observation.
Aye.
How can you manage risk when you don't understand what the problem is I have observed that very few people in Ireland and very few people in quite a number of Western countries actually don't know what the problem is.
Absolutely.
So how can they fix it if they don't know what the problem is?
So we're going to get to this question of how do you identify the problem in about 15 slides. Hang on in there. Now I have to hurry to them. So some people focus on the threat. We are getting to there. So threat-focused groups, CND, remember Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament? A lot of the green groups that are focused specifically on climate, the people who are against Monsanto, all these folks are focusing on different threats, which they're attempting to clobber so they don't actually happen. The problem is that very few of these groups actually succeed in fixing the threat that they're working against. Right? And generally speaking, the dolphins are still being pulled out of the sea and the whales are still being culled. We'll get to it. There is another green thing coming up in a minute. So, the other groups, and I will say for these threat-focused groups, some of them do succeed, right? The groups that were fighting against the ozone hole won. They actually convinced society it was necessary and then they got it sorted. Splendid. More of that. Lots more of it. So, reaction-focused groups, this is the other group. These are the people who come along after something goes completely Pete-tong and attempt to repair it. This is all the people who swarmed into Haiti, the Red Cross and bits of the UN and, what's the local group called? Say again?
Trucker Concern?
Trucker Concern? No, I was thinking of Haven, right? Haven is going out to Haiti to build houses in October. I'm trying to get them to build hex yards. We'll get around to it maybe. So all of this kind of response-focused stuff is just swarming around the problem, trying to make sure that the damage done is repaired as quickly as possible or mitigated. And that stuff is important and useful, but also inherently limited in that by the time you have those kind of problems, often it is a little late. So this is a way of thinking about this stuff, right? So first problem, detecting the risk. You mentioned that. Second thing is if you can avoid it, right? So some of these risks, we identified this risk associated with the ozone hole. We avoided the risk by ceasing to pump out the ozone-destroying chemicals. So we didn't need to mitigate it or recover from it. We just got on top of it to a pretty large degree. Mitigation, so you live in an area that floods. You change the way that your house operates so that the floodwater can be 3 feet high before it does you any damage, and it floods and it never gets over your 3 feet, so you're fine. Perfectly mitigated risk or perfectly avoided risk means you have a success. Finally, recovery, you didn't manage to avoid, you didn't manage to mitigate, now you have to pick up the pieces and try and restore function. So, general model for risk. Threat-focused groups focus on 1 and 2, reaction-focused on 3 and 4. So to answer your question, basically some groups will be trying to raise public awareness to get people to act and to avoid the problem. And that is an effort in and of itself, and then you've got other groups which are running around trying to mitigate, and we'll get into that more in a minute. Questions? Okay. So, here's your big problem. All of these groups that are attempting to get on top of this kind of problem are functioning in the context of the state. So the state is providing a whole range of infrastructure to you that you then build a charity on top of. Transitions consumes all kinds of services from the state. ASPO consumes all kinds of services from the state to attempt to change the way that the state is behaving or the way that people with power are acting. So in this context, management of risk outside of the context of the state is what you have to think about doing when you can no longer assume the state is going to be managing your risks. See what I'm saying? And this is the question of how do you recontextualize risk management as a function which is in the hands of the people rather than in the hands of the state. So, risk, sovereign default. In the event of a sovereign default, your government just stops paying its bills. And this is not remotely controversial, that happens all the time. Whether it could happen in any given place is a topic of large economic debate. Show of hands? Anyway, right? But within that kind of context, we all know that it's something that happens in some places. Systemic catastrophes, right? This is very much your kind of terrain where something breaks and for the want of a nail, right, you wind up losing first the horse, then the army, then the entire country, and then some other stuff as well. Entirely plausible, right? Pandemic flu, boom. In the event where your primary risk is the failure of the state, how do you mitigate the risk of the thing which is acting as the platform which you use to build risk mitigating organizations on top of? See what I'm saying? If the state collapses, you suddenly don't have anything sitting around which will do things like incorporation. If you can't incorporate, how are you going to build an organization to do anything at all? Right. More of a problem than it sounds. Any questions? Yes? Interestingly enough, I generally think that the church is best understood at a purely administrative level as the remnants of the state of 500 years ago. Like the actual structure, the governance structures of the Catholic Church are the governance structures the church had when it was essentially the state or the super-state organization. You know, I think that the Catholic Church of a few hundred years ago is almost better understood as being the precursor to the UN than a religion. I mean, both functions, of course, but you know what I'm saying. Good? Well, okay. Proceed. So, we have a set of things that we are concerned about. And this stuff is very real. It's complex and technical and hard to ascertain exactly how serious it is. And we're trying to get something done about it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, right? I mean, the idea that you're taking your Monday evenings to come and listen to somebody tell you about what you can do if the systems that you're currently using to keep yourself alive break completely is an indication of real public concern, right? I mean, think about that for a minute. We're in a position where the concern that the state will not function properly has become such a pressing matter that the public are beginning to organise to catch the baby if the state drops it. This is not something that is formed as a mythology. This is something that's formed by a lot of rigorous analysis with people coming to the conclusion that we are steering the boat into the iceberg. And now we're going to have to do something. This, right? This is your fundamental threat model, right? If it breaks, USSR, Argentina, Iraq, Afghanistan, Detroit, all of this stuff is real. It's all happened within living memory. I mean, have you watched the stuff coming out of Detroit? Farming with horses? In the place that used to produce all of America's cars and then some? It's just amazing, right? And imagine if we lived in Detroit, if we were having this meeting in Detroit, and outside in the window there are buildings that used to be, you know, head offices of companies which have become just, you know, complete wastelands. If they were talking about bulldozing a third of the city to make space for more fields. You know, this stuff is really an ongoing part of other people's lives, and we're worried that it might come here. Oh, oops, sorry. No, maybe? Okay, swiftly on. So, to get on top of this, we have to start thinking at a deeper level than mapping the current set of systems and then assuming that some of them will be there and some of them won't. We actually have to get back underneath the problem in a different way. So, threat modeling. And I want to just point out, so threat focused, that's detect and avoid. Reaction focused, that's mitigate and respond. So this is very much in the detect and avoid part. Governments evolved to fight wars. Anything that managed to become a state because it fought wars and won. That's how you get to be a country. The problem is that they're evolved to fight wars and they are very poorly evolved to handle global risk. So, you know, governments didn't really have to do cooperation with all of the other nation states on Earth simultaneously to come to international agreements until recently, because if it was happening one state over from where you were never going to hear about it. You see what I'm saying? They grew up being, you know, directly managing territorial borders and working in relatively long timescales because change was slow. Now change is hyper quick and everything is globalized. The state is not very well evolved to handle this kind of risk. And as a result, it's doing it very badly. So this is a simple way of thinking about different kinds of risks. And I'm just going to scooch through these because they're not critical to what we're actually talking about. It's just a useful framework. So, spilled milk. Can you read the stuff on the side? Scope, severity, complexity, source, odds. Very simple risk. Crime. Individual, theft to murder, point risk because it happens in one place at a time rather than everywhere at once, caused by humans. Asteroid strike. Could affect a whole country, could affect the whole world, would destroy anything it affects. Point risk because it happens in one place at a time unless it just wipes the entire planet out. Plagues. Affects all of the people. A lot of them die. It's all over the place at the same time, which means you can't swarm resources from the edges to help some problem in the center. It comes from other species, which means it's an evolving threat, and this stuff was actually quite common. Got to get on top of that. Climate change. This is the first of the current high risks, the hot stuff. So, global risk, severe disruption. It's a systemic risk, which means it happens everywhere at once. The cause is humans, and it's happening now. Financial collapse. Global economic risk, serious disruption, systemic, caused by people. Right? So, the similarity of these two risks is also part of why the governments are unable to handle them in a very similar way. It's a class of risks. These risks are systemic and they're complicated. And intergovernmental cooperation would be required to resolve them within current frameworks, and we're doing a horrible job of handling this class of risks. What we're looking at is a failure to govern. And this is the real deep core, right? The governments that we appointed to manage our risks are failing to manage the risks, which is to say they're failing to govern. And this is a huge global issue because as individuals, we've gotten used to having a state that does the right thing in a way that allows us to get on with our lives. We're now in a position where we have a state and a set of states internationally that are doing the wrong thing in a way which is threatening our lives. And the people who were most acutely aware of this transition were CND. CND screamed blue murder that the governments had gone bonkers because they were building nuclear weapons in huge quantities, and this is not what we appointed governments to do on our behalf. That was the active threat. The passive threat is the governments are like, well, this is really going to mess up the next election. Why don't we just shove it back under the rug for another 4 years with peak oil, with climate change, and with the great financial collapse, and with a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean, this is serious business. It's a failure in political culture that goes back hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. This is the kind of stuff that wiped out Rome. Failure to govern. And it does not help that we are now so populous, right? We're so many and we are so powerful that we threaten the existence of the very planet by our own everyday average behavior combined. Tough stuff. Questions? Yes?
Just want to go back to the answer.
Yeah. Could I suggest you yell a little louder? Because
Yeah, I assume you're familiar with the Stoneleigh presentation.
yes.
Would you be in broad agreement with that?
So 2002, I decided that it was very likely that the entire global financial system was going to collapse in the next 10 years. And I stopped using money to store my wealth and started working on the hardest problems that I could find and publishing, hoping to store my wealth in the form of reputation and trust. So my model of why that was going to happen was not like Stoneleigh's model. It's based on the work of a guy called Buckminster Fuller, and it's described in a book called Grunch of Giants, Grunch, Grunch of Giants. And it basically suggests that there are long-term systems effects in capitalist societies which bring periodic apocalyptic financial collapses. So I'm not, the exact details of the how and the why, not so sure about. I personally thought the risk was likely enough to change my entire life nearly 10 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean it will happen, right? Nobody would be happier than me if we somehow managed to right the situation. But I took the risk seriously enough to change my life to do something about my own experience of it, and I learned a lot of this stuff in that context. So, does that make sense? Like, general picture is probably right, but I haven't looked at the details of that exact model. I think it's probably about right, but, there's a lot of play on these things, and I think the actual core of the problem is substantially beyond human understanding. 700 complicated interwoven factors, all looks a bit rickety. I don't want to say your guess is as good as mine or my guess is as good as hers, but past a certain threshold of certainty, the question becomes what am I going to do about it rather than exactly when is the axe going to fall. Okay. Any other questions right there? Yes? Is it?
I'm not sure it's a question or a statement.
Okay, then leave it for the end. All right, so now it might be time to get into the doing something. Let me check my time so I don't keep us here till midnight. Okay. So how would we approach dealing with this stuff? This is the model that I'm here to basically teach and give away. It's under an open license. It's called State in a Box, and it came for the work that I did for the Pentagon on Iraq. It's about figuring out how to manage really, really harsh problems. And the core of that is getting people to be able to work together in new ways in a hurry to deal with a problem that you haven't seen before. Right? Something terrible happens, everybody does the right thing, you take the minimum amount of damage possible in the situation. Something terrible happens, everybody screws up working together, you get Hurricane Katrina where 2,000 Americans die, it's almost as many people as died in 9/11, right? 2,000 Americans die in a disaster where there was 72 hours warning and 40 years of prediction of the threat. Right? Think about that. 40 years, the risk in New Orleans is flooding. 3 days before the flooding starts, everybody knows the flooding will come. 2,000 people die in the wealthiest country on earth, and everybody afterwards blames it on failure to communicate. Right, so that's what we're trying to avoid, right? We're trying to avoid disaster, right? The core concept is unity of effort without unity of command. And this is a concept that goes by many different names. People generally instinctively feel this is the way that we need to approach 21st century problems. But the military terminology, unity of effort without unity of command, and I think that it's a very, very good goal. And I think that those precise words convey exactly the meaning that most people want from things like consensus. What they want is everybody to be working together without having to create a boss. So, good term, do suggest you use it, if it's useful to you. Is this overkill for peak oil? Right? So, Mr. O'Rourke, is this overkill for peak oil? Not in your world. All right, what do you reckon? Mr. Korowitz.
The thing is, people, there's lots of interactive things.
Yes.
If the chip goes down, it will probably go down rapidly and systemically.
Absolutely.
So I would say the state in the box is probably a good place to
Yes.
go with it.
If anything, it's underkill in your model. Not really sure that's big enough, but you can give it a try, Gupta. Okay, so yes, it is using a sledgehammer. It's either using a sledgehammer to crack a wall, or it's using a sledgehammer to crack a fortress, but it's certainly not underpowered. Okay, so keep the stuff that keeps you alive running. So how are we going to do it? First, figure out what is keeping you alive. So, for example, say that you're diabetic. What's keeping you alive is insulin. Second question, what is the threat to your supply of insulin? Perhaps the threat is the hospital will get looted in the apocalypse. Third step, avoid the threats and mitigate the risks. Right? This is point 2 and point 3. Avoid, mitigate. So how can you avoid your insulin supply being threatened? Maybe you store it at home. Maybe you change your diet radically to get back off insulin if you've got the right kind of diabetes. Maybe you do something entirely different, like moving to a lower risk country. Step 4, repeat until safety. Now, this is a little harder than it sounds. First problem, you don't control most of what you need to stay alive. Second problem, you're competing with the current systems, which are very, very efficient and very, very fragile. So you wind up in this position where the current systems will not let you radically change your affairs. Like, you can't really put a composting toilet in a suburban house. If you try, they take your house away. Right? And finally, you're in the position where you're going to have to spend a bunch of resources building resilience, but what it's going to cost you is the ability to do other things. If your community puts solar panels on all of its houses, it takes the capital that could have been used to build a hospital. Hard problems. So this approach of find all the interdependencies in the global system and harden all the vital links. Mr. Korowitz, is this possible? No. Right? And that problem, again, it's rediscovered lots and lots of times and given different names, right? VUCA is a particularly good one. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous problems. Complex operations. Center for Complex Operations talks about this stuff. Complex contingencies is another term. Urban planning discovered this terrain. They called it wicked problems. Right? It's the general problem that if you've got 40 things, each one of which affects 40 other things. When you try and build a big old map of the problem, you wind up with 1,600 things that are connected to each other, and you rapidly exceed human comprehension. Right? The brain is not enough to fit all of it in, and you just fail. Right? So we need to find some way of doing this, and that way isn't going to work. Very quick questions. We're beginning to get a little tight on time. Okay. Boom. So, simple critical infrastructure maps to the rescue. This is under a license called Creative Commons, so you can download it, you can use it, you can bring it into your transition groups, you can do stuff with it. This is not intended to be something where I tell you the world is ending. It's something where I say you make up your mind whether the world is ending, have a planning tool that will help you accomplish your goals both at a transition level and also at an apocalyptic level. So, 4 kinds of actors in society: individuals, groups, organizations, and states. We're going to ask, what do these things need to exist? What are the precursors to have a group? What are the precursors to have an organization? What do you need to remain a state? For an individual, there are 6 things that will stop you existing as an individual. Getting too hot, getting too cold, being hungry till you die, being thirsty till you die, being ill till you die, and being injured till you die. 6 ways to die. So we've cut what it needs to keep life going for you from the 7,000 things that typically contribute to your welfare to the 6 basic functions that must be in your environment so you don't die. This is a brutal level of simplification, and it's designed to get the problem down to the point where human beings in small groups can manage the risks in their environments in complex contingencies. So let's think about this right now, right? Is anybody in this room currently dying? In the now sense, rather than in the sort of philosophical sense, right? We're all dying in the philosophical sense, but I mean in the right now, right? Not Sylvia Plath, but, Rambo. So, right? Number 1, are we too hot? No, we're not dying of being too hot because we're in Ireland. Ecosystem services prevent us from dying of overheating. Are we too cold? No. Clothes, building, heating and cooling, external environment which is not too cold so we're not freezing to death. Generally speaking, it's a combination of ecosystem services and tools. Hunger, huge global supply chain that put food in your belly, right? And you're probably eating right now in your stomach. You probably have molecules which have traveled thousands of miles, right? Your body is made of stuff that was shipped around the world. No wonder people are nervous. Communications, thirst, right? Water from some local water source, filtered, fed, done. Illness, health services, injury, nobody is currently attacking anybody else. Now, how did we get here? Communications were used for you to discover that it was happening. Transport, even if it's roads and a bicycle or you walked, brought you here. The space that we're in is a workspace, and resource control is there aren't a bunch of people in here drinking and playing loud music preventing us from getting this done. So the things which are necessary for us to form as a group: communications, transport, workspace, resources. Very simple. Organizations, right? So, right, here we are at Cultivate, right? Cultivate is an organization. That's, yes, you. Cultivate, organization? Yes, right? So, to be an organization, the people who worked together to create this had to share a map of reality, which was that green issues were important. Transition is relevant to a lot of that. That there is some kind of path that we want to proceed down to do something about the situation. Map and plan. The thing exists because of a map of reality and a plan of action. Succession is all the stuff that you inherit from the government, which makes you an organization rather than a tribe. And it's things like boards of directors. It's the ability to transfer the leadership role to implement the map and the plan rather than having the whole thing be dependent on personal whim. It's what makes you an organization rather than a gang or a tribe. Finally, the state, right? We're all citizens of one country or another. What makes a state a state? This list is a little more abstract, and we're not going to dig into it, but basically, effective organizations like police and fire services, list of citizens, map of territories gives you the limit of the state's legal jurisdiction, and international recognition ratifies that these elements are present. So what we have there is an 18-point list, which gives you the very most basic skinny on the systems which keep you going. Right? 18-point list. Now, it's simple enough that if you look at it for 10 or 15 minutes and you draw it out a couple of times on the back of an envelope, make a cross over here, individual, group, organization, state, and you try and remember the list, pretty soon you'll get to the point where you can remember that list and even explain and teach it to people. So the idea is that this was a fast acquisition tool. You have a crisis, you teach it to all the people who are trying to respond to the crisis. Because they now have a very simple shared map, you can get them to form a simple shared plan, and you can get the situation stabilized using unity of effort without unity of command. So it's a toolkit for rapidly forming a temporary organization to secure a situation so that people don't die. And as long as nobody's dying, you have the time to figure out the more complex responses that you might want to implement. Now, the trick of this is, the reason this is not in this kind of VUCA territory where everything is completely complicated, messed up, and impossible, is because the vast majority of the complexity of the global system is used to produce Barbie dolls, right? It's made to, produce fancy clothing that has no real function other than looking kind of smart. It's used to produce, is anybody going to die if we run out of tripods? No, right? Most of the things in the global system are completely useless from a survival perspective. And as a result, if you can rapidly identify the few percent of what is in your environment that you need to live, you can safely ignore everything else, right? In the event of a national catastrophe, you can relatively quickly index the critical things which must exist, and everybody else you can say, whoa, we'll get to you later, thank you very much, move on. Simple. Manageable set of system interdependencies means you go from having an unmanageable problem where everything is connected to everything else, it's a big ball of string, to a manageable problem from a strictly survival perspective. Does this kind of make sense? It's a minimal approach. And once you've got those things, those basic 18 points covered, at that point you've got the breathing space to deal with the complexity of the rest. Right? Keep everything alive, therefore you constrain the problem. Questions? Yes?
Is that not kind of like presuming that everybody thinks the same way? Like, not everybody is going to want to go along with the thing. Some people will take advantage of the situation. They won't all come behind this thing out and make it.
Yes, this is for the people who are trying to cooperate to make everything work. One of the problems that you might face in this kind of situation is how do you deal with the people who are not trying to make it work? And that would become a security problem. So, one of the things that you have to do in a crisis, you have to manage the people who are working against a successful solution to the problem. And you might need an organization to do that, like the police force. But I'm not assuming that you start with perfect cooperation. Any other questions? Okay, move on. So, the interdependencies. I'm going to actually skip this section because we're a little short on time, but I will give you the concept in one slide, which is this. Right now, we're in a civilization where cheap food, cheap energy, and cheap tools are used to produce more cheap food, more cheap energy, and more cheap tools. So the name that I give this is AIAC, AgroIndustrial, sorry, got to go back here, AgroIndustrial Autocatalysis. So that basically means is the agro-industrial system maintains the agro-industrial system and causes it to grow. It's the ability to go and buy a bolt for 11 cents that if you had to make it by hand would cost you $111. That system is the core of what has given us the world that we're in, and it would be really nice if we were a little more organized about protecting its core functions so we could continue to make things like MRI machines. Right? And I'm suggesting again that this is a generally useful term because it compresses what is vital about what's sometimes called Western civilization or industrial civilization or anything else into a simple term that people can just use. Boom. How does this affect IAC? Oh, it's going to break it. So, skip. Sorry, no questions. Boom. So, let's get down to the core. Survivalism is individual and group, short-term, stockpile-oriented. See, we've gone over these models, and now it's possible to look at the projects which are currently ongoing to try and address these risks in slightly clearer terms. Green Wizards, right? It's individual and group level infrastructure, rebuilding from skill banks. Transition towns, group and organization predominantly oriented around supply chain risk management. Dark mountain, right? Changing the way that people think, that's all the way up there at the organization level where you're talking about shared maps and shared plans. So what we have is a large, complex whole system, and the different groups that are trying to manage these risks are approaching different parts of it. They're all focused on one area. Some of them are individual focused, some of them are group focused, some of them are organization focused. For example, ASPO is probably largely organization and state focused, and it's largely in the detect and avoid camp. Right? So you have an interlocking system of many groups approaching the constraint management of global risks. Now, you are unfortunately not going to be able to read this, so let me very quickly point out what's what. 6 needs for individuals, 4 needs for groups, 3 needs for organizations, 5 needs for the nation state. And then across the way, individual, household, village or neighborhood, town, region, country, world. And this grid is a very basic high-level map of what it is to live in a complex society and the things that keep you going in it. So, let's look at the interdependencies. Survivalism covers the first 6 needs at an individual level and very little else. Green Wizards is individual and household level, but it's still basically those 6 needs and not much more. Transitions is those 6 needs, but largely managed at a village and a neighborhood and a town level. Make sense? Interlocking. The big differences in philosophy between the individual, the household, and the group level of response between survivalism, Green Wizards, and transitions, it's all basically the same technologies, it's all basically the same skills, it's 3 different levels of social organization behind that. Open Farm Tech, Marcin Jakubowski's project in America, where they're attempting to build a set of machine tools which are capable of producing the same set of machine tools in the workshop. So you have a drill press and a saw and some other stuff that you can use to build a drill press and a saw and some other stuff, and tractors and well diggers and all the rest of this kind of stuff. A very small autocatalytic set of tools, IAC in a box. Hexiart project, this is what I'm actually best known for, it's an emergency housing project. All we do is shelter, and we only do it at the household level. River Simple is an open source car project. So it's a car that's profitable to produce and runs as short of as 1,000 units, and it's hydrogen based, so you can run it from things like wind power. Okay, done. Very, very simple, very, very powerful. Right? The idea of being able to do short-run car production means that you can keep some form of, electric car, even in a situation where you don't have the ability to produce 1 million in a run and you can't set up a huge complex factory. Super simple design. Dark Mountain, right, way up here in the legal infrastructure that allows you to figure out how to manage and share resources is changing the way that people see what resources are. How do we manage? Seasteading, very briefly, this is a bunch of guys who want to build new countries on floating concrete oil platforms as research projects for different ways of doing governance. Run by Milton Friedman's grandson. Backing from the founder of eBay. So they're not short of money and they're not short of intellectual clout, and they're doing stuff. So the bottom line is that these maps allow you to figure out what groups are in your environment, what they're working on, and who's covering which bases. It's not a very precise tool, it's an easy tool, and it gets people focused on how they can cooperate with unity of effort, without unity of command, to manage the risks in the environment. Okay? Very briefly highlight 2 risks. I'm just going to skip through these. Medical supply chains, we covered the insulin example. Cold Katrina is grid failure in cold cities like Minneapolis. Those are very urgent risks, and I'm unaware that those risks are properly handled. It'd be really nice if transitions and similar groups begun to build awareness of medical supply chain, because that stuff is really important. The question is, where are you going to store the additional medical supplies to provide some buffering? So, should I take questions now, or should we move straight to the panel? Okay, so, yes?
What do you think is the replacement of the nation state if that fails? When it fails? What's the biggest collective governance that's possible?
I think that the city-state is a very real thing. So, the city-state is something that's got a very, very long history, and municipal governance is very solid and real and tangible, so it's likely to be very important and to continue to exist. So I think that if you saw a really severe global shock, you might see a lot of municipalities that would become very concerned with running their own affairs, and then gradually they would kind of begin to figure out what to do with the territory in between. That is just a guess, but I think it's the most likely outcome of the most severe shocks.
But would cities be able to survive because they wouldn't have enough agricultural base?
The different cities have very different risks when it comes to ag. For example, I mean, Ireland has got something like 4 times the amount of arable land you need to feed the entire population. But if you go to the UK, it's just barely enough, maybe, if we got our act together. And if you look at, say, Manhattan, you know, the population densities are so enormous that you wind up with a catchment area that's hundreds of miles before you've actually gotten food sufficiency again. So I think it's specific city by city rather than large scale simple risk.